Andrew Cuneo here. Today I was going to be going over Gabriel Nassif's draft from day 2 of the recent Pro Tour. This is the top table at the start of day 2, so these are the people with the best records. I think Gab was 7-1 at this point, and there's one undefeated player. There might be a couple of people who are 6-1-1, but this is definitely the toughest draft pod of day 2, given that it's the people with the best records. Gab's seated between Shota and David Inglis, who are both excellent players, so this is certainly going to be a tough draft for him. Let's take a look at his picks and see how he navigated it. So here we're getting a lot of glare, but the cards in the pack, we've got a Sword of the Final Frontier, which I'm going to insist is the correct name for that card, a Bladehold War Whip, and a Drown in Ichor. Over the course of the video, I'm going to cite some data from 17 Lands. It's a really good website if you're interested in results of drafts from Arena. They have a really good source of data. So looking at the data, the Sword of the Final Frontier has a 59.8% win rate, whereas the Bladehold War Whip has a 63.5% win rate. And Drown in Ichor is kind of bringing up the rear at 58.6. Now, the way that their data is gathered, the average card is going to have a 54.9% win rate, or that's the average win rate of the people contributing the data. So if you want to look at, whether a card is better than average or not, average is around 55%. So all three of these cards he's considering are clearly above average. If you were going strictly by the data, you would pick the Bladehold War Whip, but that is a gold card rather than the Sword, which is a colorless card. The Sword is going to make almost every possible deck you could draft in this format, whereas the War Whip, you might not be able to play it at all. You might wind up splashing it in a 3-color deck, where it's going to perform substantially worse in a 3-color deck. So I think this is an easy pick to just take the Sword. That's what Gab does, so I really like the way this is starting. Really good first pick. Looking at this next pack, there's two cards that kind of jump out. The Volt Charge and the Chimney Rabble, I think, are just the two best cards in the pack. Going by the 17 Lands data, the Chimney Rabble has a 59.6% win rate, which is better than Volt Charge's 56.5%. But this is a case where I don't think you really want to just go strictly by the numbers, because the Chimney Rabble is pretty easy to replace with another creature in red, which would not be quite as good, but would be somewhat similar. But Volt Charge is not a card you're going to have a lot of opportunities to pick up a slightly worse version of. If you want to get a removal spell, you're going to have to pick it more aggressively than you're going to have to pick the creatures. So that's what Gab is doing here. One thing that's a little bit interesting to note is that the War Whip was by far the best card in the pack he just passed, and it is a red card. So there might be a little bit of concern that the person on his left, David Inglis, is going to wind up in red because he's being passed the War Whip. I think that that's something that you really shouldn't worry about that much when drafting. It's okay if you're sharing a color with the person on your left. Certainly if you're sharing one color, maybe Gab should in the back of his mind be thinking, I don't really want to go straight into red-white after having passed a red-white-gold card immediately to my left. But I think that this is just the clear best pick in the pack. Volt Charge it's not a great second pick, but it is a solid card. Looking at this next pack, we've got an Evolving Adaptive over really nothing else that is at all comparable. So I think this is a pretty clear Evolving Adaptive, and that's what Gab's going to pick. Moving on to pick 4, we've got a Necrogen Rot Priest, which getting this 4th is a sign that you might be able to go green-black, and Gab isn't so deep into anything that he couldn't switch out. Really, with the Rot Priest, you could use the Evolving Adaptive. Probably you'd be giving up on the Volt Charge. There's also an Exuberant Fuseling, which red is probably the best color in the set, and it looks like that's what Gab's going to go for. I think that was a real choice in the draft. I think I probably would have taken the Fuseling as well, but The Rot Priest, I think, would have also been a perfectly fine pick. Here we see a Furnace Punisher, and really not much else. If you had picked the Rot Priest last pack, you might take the Ichorspit Basilisk here, and that would be okay as an approach. Given that Gab took the red card last pack, he's going to take the red card here. Makes sense. I think that Conduit of Worlds is not a card you really should want to play with at all. There's a Blazing Crescendo. This is just a pretty bad pack. I think Blazing Crescendo is a card that could easily make Gab's deck given what he's picked so far, and I just wouldn't worry too much about that pack. Certainly don't let that shape the direction of your draft. Then we see a Hazardous Blast, which I think Hazardous Blast is a quite good card in this format. I'd be very happy to get it 7th pick. I think you're going to want 1 or 2 copies in basically every red deck. I mean, not necessarily putting 2 copies in the main deck, but remember they're playing best of 3 with sideboarding. Having access to 2 cards after sideboarding is just great if you get paired against like a white-black deck. Here there's a Furnace Spellbomb. We've got Whisper of the Dross. So it's pretty clear that Gab had a choice between going into red and going into maybe a green-black deck, and he's gone for the red deck. Which I think that I would have done the same thing in his position. I think it might have worked out a little bit better for him if he had gone more into green-black, though. Here we're seeing a Blazing Crescendo and not much else, so I think this is a pretty easy pick given that he's, focusing on red. We've got Awaken the Sleeper and this 3/2 white guy, which so far Gab hasn't picked a white card, so I think you would just go with the red card here, and that's what he does. Awaken the Sleeper is not a particularly good card. It sometimes makes the deck if you're a red-black deck. Here we've got Thrill of Possibility, which I think is a perfectly fine card. I think gets disrespected an awful lot. There's also a Testament Bearer, which I don't really understand why Gab just picked the Testament Bearer. I think he might have misclicked there. So Thrill of Possibility, I think, is a card that's really criminally underrated by people. It's just really good at helping you find your best cards. It's really good at helping you smooth out some of your awkward draws. Now, if you're approaching this from drafting on Arena in best of 1, Thrill of Possibility is not great there because of the way the hand smoother works. It really dramatically changes the value of that card. So if you look at the 17 lands data, the game in hand weight for Thrill of Possibility in best of 1 is 49.7%, which that is awful. Like you really shouldn't be putting in cards that have that low of a win rate in your deck very often. But if you look at their data from best of 3, it has a 55% win rate, which is, that's just a solid card that you should, expect to play most of the time in your deck. And so I think that really, given that Gab it is solidly in red, he should have taken Thrill of Possibility here. Now, he did just get the Awaken the Sleeper, so maybe he's thinking, I might wind up in like a red-black sack deck, and that's really the only kind of deck where you ever wind up playing Testament Bearer. So maybe that was some of his thought process, but I would have definitely taken Thrill of Possibility. I really didn't like that pick at all. Here we've got another pack with a Thrill of Possibility. Also Experimental Augury, which is actually a pretty good blue card. Taking Thrill makes sense. Here he's going to get a blue combat trick over a rare. And here we've got another rare. If you've never done a high-level draft, these people are playing for a lot of money. Nobody's going to be rare drafting. That's why there are so many of the rares still in the packs at the end, at least the bad rares. So looking at this pack, Hexgold Slash certainly jumps out. I think it's the best red common, and it is just an overall great card. We do have Kembo, which is kind of an equipment rare and white. And remember, Gab did get that first pick sword. So in a different universe, Kembo might have some amount of appeal, but I think Hexgold Slash is just too good to pass. There's also some really good green cards in the Armored Scrap Gorger and the Copperhoof Vorak, but Hexgold Slash is just a very easy pick from that pack. All right, Pack 2, pick 2. See a Silvok Battle Chair, Bladegraft Aspirant, and I think there was a Venomous Brutalizer in the pack. So if Gab wants to stick with red, I mean, the Bladegraft Aspirant is really not a card you want to be picking second out of a pack. It's oftentimes not going to make the deck. The choice between the Brutalizer and the Battle Chair is pretty interesting if Gab wants to go for a green card. Going by the win rate data, the Battle Chair has a 57.1% win rate, whereas the Brutalizer has a 53.2% win rate, which, I mean, that really makes the Brutalizer look bad. It's a 4-mana 4/4 with, Toxic and this Proliferate ability, and it's still performing as a below-average card. And I think the explanation for that is just because putting 4-drops in your deck that die to Hexgold Slash is really miserable. And, like, the green-based Toxic decks, I think, really suffer from that fact. The Battle Chair looks not that impressive, but my experience with it is it's actually pretty good. It's not a great format for it. This is not a format where you really want to make sure you have 6-drops in your deck. But when I've been forced to play the Battle Chair, I've been reasonably happy with it. I think out of this pack, I would be taking the Battle Chair. Let's see what Gab's going to do. I don't like that the Brutalizer's coming to the front. All right, he's going to take the Aspirant and just stay red. I mean, that's a very disappointing second pick to have to make, because the Aspirant's either not going to make your deck or it's going to be one of the worst cards in the deck. Pack 2, pick 3. We've got a white 2-drop. We've got Free from the Flesh. We've got the Raptor. I guess Gab's thinking like maybe he should be going into white. He really hasn't seen many green cards. And the few times he has seen green cards, he hasn't taken them. I think that probably Free from the Flesh is the pick here. Remember, he does have the 2 Blazing Crescendos already, so this is a 3rd combat trick. You're kind of getting to the point where you have all the combat tricks you really want at that point. So probably don't need any more red combat tricks. Ooh, it's another Thrill of Possibility. It's probably not going to be a very good pick. This pack there's a Skull Bomb. This is another one of these really bad packs for him, just because there's no good red cards, and he hasn't solidified a second color, and there's really nothing even that would put him into a second color. I think he could just close his eyes and pick anything here, and it would be fine, because they're all bad. He goes with the Lightbringer. All right, we got another shot at a Chimney Rabble, which I think you would certainly take over Molten Rebuke. There is a Predation Steward in the pack, which the one weakness of Gab's deck at this point is he doesn't have many 2-drops, but he's just going to stick with red. All right, we got pack 2, pick 6 here. And this is kind of nice to see a Chimney Rabble this steep into the pack. That's just, a strong playable. It's definitely going to make your deck better. Getting that 6th pick is pretty nice. Pick 7, and wow, there's a Barbed Batterfist still in the pack. That is excellent. As Gab is desperate for 2-drops and getting 7th pick, which is actually that's a good 2-drop. It looks like red is reasonably open, and there's just been a few packs that broke badly and did not have playable red cards in them. Pick 8 here. We've got a Hazardous Blast. We've got a red Spell Bomb, and we've got, for some reason, he's pulled this white 2/3 to the front. And I don't know what that pick was about. I definitely would have taken the second Hazardous Blast there. I think probably what Gab is thinking is he wants a second color, and so he's, considering maybe I should be a red-white deck. He has picked 1 or 2 white cards, but I think Hazardous Blast is just a card that you're happy with the second copy, and I would not have made that pick. All right, pick 9. We've got an Autonomous Furnace. There's another Awaken the Sleeper. I think if Gab was drafting red-black, the Sleeper might be a consideration, but the Furnace is fine. It's not a lock to make his deck, but those lands sometimes make your deck if you're trying to play a higher mana count. All right, someone has picked the Brutalizer out of this pack, and there's still a Battle Chair in the pack, so Gab takes the Battle Chair. I could see taking the Brutalizer, whoever took it, if they're trying to draft a toxic deck, that makes sense. This pack has basically nothing in it. There's a Mirror Custodian, and there's the Blue Curator. I don't really love Gab's pick there, where he took the Custodian, which is really bad. I think it's basically never going to make anyone's deck, unless they're desperately short on creatures. The Curator, though, actually can be pretty good in some blue controlling decks, and you have to remember this is a pod draft, so that was an opportunity to potentially hate draft a card that one of your opponents actually might play. Generally, if you're not doing a pod draft, hate drafting makes no sense at all. Even in a pod draft, hate drafting makes very little sense. But this is one of those spots where I think it actually does make sense, because Gab just took a card that I think just is never going to be in his deck at all. It's like a 0% chance to be played, and he could have hate drafted a blue card that might actually be a solid playable in somebody else's deck. Here we've got another opportunity with Thrill of Possibility, which that's what I would pick here. Gab's going to go for the Green Skull Bomb, which is also fringe playable. We've got the Centurion, which that would go nicely with the Awaken the Sleepers. A Veil. All right, digging into pack 3. Gab's really going to be looking for, hopefully, some more cheap creatures, maybe another Hex Gold Slash out of this pack, maybe some bombs. We've got a Chimney Rabble and a Furnace Strider, which the Chimney Rabble is definitely like the game in hand win rate all-star here. The Furnace Strider only has a 57.7% win rate, whereas the Chimney Rabble's at 59.6. There's also Carnivorous Canopy, which is a very strong sideboard card. But I think he should just go with the Chimney Rabble. All right, that's what he's going to pick. Pick 2. We've got another Chimney Rabble. We've got Urbresk's Anointer. The Anointer really requires you to have a pretty specific deck. There's also the Volshock Splitter. I don't think that Gab has enough oil stuff for the Anointer. You really want that to do 2 or 3 damage when it comes into play, and I just don't think he's going to have enough stuff in play to support that. The Chimney Rabble's looking pretty good here. Uh-oh, we've got a Monumental Facade being pulled to the front. I do not like the looks of that. So the Monumental Facade is occasionally playable if you have a deck with a lot of oil payoffs. Gab does not have that many oil payoffs. He has the 2 1-drops at this point that pay him off for being oil, but they're in 2 different colors. And so I just don't think you're really going to want to play a colorless land in a low curve deck that's trying to play 1-drops in both colors. So I think that pick really doesn't make very much sense. I definitely would have taken the Chimney Rabble. Pick 3. There's that Forge Hammer guy, who's a pretty weak red creature. We've got a Contagious Vorak, and I think I saw Resistant Skywarden in the pack. So this is really a spot where you take the Skywarden, I think, if you're trying to be mono red, or if you still don't want to decide on a second color. Gab's going to take the Vorak. I think that's a good pick. The Vorak is the best card in the pack, and he does have the Evolving Adaptive, which is a pretty strong green 1-drop. So at this point, he's pretty committed to just being red-green, I think. It's taken a long time to get into the second color, but at this point, you're going to have to go with it. There's not going to be any reason to switch around anymore through the duration of pack 3. Here we've got a Molten Rebuke, which is not a great card, but it's an okay card. And given that they're going to be playing best of 3, sometimes you're going to need to sideboard in a removal spell because your opponent's just going to have something you just have to be able to kill, like a Argentum Masticore or Glissa, something like that. So I think taking Molten Rebuke here would be a nice thing to be able to do. If we look, Gab's considering this Lattice Blade Warden, and that's what he's going to pick. I think that in a certain sense, taking the Warden there is kind of a cost Gab is paying for having picked Monumental Facade out of the previous pack. Where if he had just taken another Chimney Rabble, he would have had, plenty of 4-drops, and he could have maybe taken the more flexible card here. But the Facade, he's just sort of like -1 playable because of that previous pick. So I think that taking I guess it's the Lattice Blade Mantis, it makes sense, but I would have much rather seen him navigate these previous 2 picks by taking Chimney Rabble into Molten Rebuke, as opposed to Monumental Facade into Lattice Blade Mantis. Got another Blazing Crescendo here. There's an Annihilating Glare. There's a Mandible Justiciar that's pulled to the front. I think he should probably just take the Blazing Crescendo. I don't know that you're going to play 3 copies of that in a deck, but there's nothing else. So he's taking the Mandible Justiciar. I'm not sure if that's a hate draft. I think if I was going to hate draft there, I would have taken Annihilating Glare. That might be Gab continuing to hedge, thinking he might be playing white, which the Justiciar is not really a good reason to be white, but it does have the property of being a 2-drop. I'm not sure what the motivation behind that pick was. I would have just gone with the Blazing Crescendo, probably. This is getting a little concerning. There's no red cards in the pack. There's really just no good cards in the pack. He's looking at that white combat trick. He certainly doesn't need a white combat trick. He's just going to take the Basilisk. That probably won't make his deck, but you could play it if you really needed to. All right, we got another 1-drop, the Scamp versus the Oil Gorger Troll. I think that he doesn't have enough oil stuff to really make the Troll all that appealing. He's got a little bit of oil stuff, but you really want the Troll to be drawing you a card almost always. And the Scamp's perfectly fine. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. He doesn't have 2-drops, but he does have some 1-drops, so he is going to be playing to the board on the early turns with his 1-drops. Here we've got a Rustvine Cultivator versus a Predation Steward. I would definitely take the Predation Steward. It would be his second actual 2-drop creature if you count the Vermiridan equipment. The Cultivator ramps you, which he's taking the Cultivator, but he doesn't have that high of a curve. And also, I think that part of the reason the Cultivator is appealing is that as a 1-drop in a deck with a typical curve, you're going to tend to have more 2-drops than 1-drops. So 1-drops become more appealing because you can get draws where you go 1-drop into 2-drop, and you just get pretty far ahead. But Gab has a lot of 1-drops and doesn't have very many 2-drops. So I think that just being able, once you no longer have the advantage that you can draw the 1-drop as your only 1-drop, so you can go 1-drop, 2-drop, I think that the Predation Steward becomes a lot better. So I definitely would have gone with the Steward there. Here we've got the Sprinter, we've got the Bardich. He's going to take the Sprinter. That could maybe make his deck, but that is not a very good card. Got a Thrill of Possibility. There's a Trawler Drake if he wants to hate draft. I think going with Thrill of Possibility makes sense. That's his second copy, I believe, so he could play 2 copies. We've got a Centurion in red if you just desperately need a playable, which he's going to take. And honestly, he might desperately need that playable. Another Autonomous Furnace, I think is the name. And there's a Veil. I would have left that in the pack and just hoped somebody else would play it. Prologue to Pharesis. All right. So this is the possible cards that Gab could have in his red-green deck based on what he drafted. I've cut all of the completely unplayable cards and the off-color cards. If you look, the first four columns are cards I think that she should just play 100% of the time. If you look in the rightmost column, those are the cards that are up for consideration, which I think you're going to want to either play 17 lands, at which point you're going to be playing 4 cards from that column, or you could play 16 lands and play 5 cards from that column. So the first thing that stands out to me is I would definitely want to play the first copy of Thrill of Possibility. I probably would want to play the Sylvok Battle Chair. It's a little bit awkward that it's a double green card in a deck that is mostly red, but it's also a 6-drop. You do have the Rustvine Cultivator, which, that's a way to get to double green mana, because if you've got the Cultivator in play, obviously you've got 1 forest, and at that point the Cultivator is going to be able to give you your second green. So, you could probably play the Battle Chair off of like 7 forests if you wanted to, assuming you're playing the Cultivator. And you've got the Contagious Vorak, that's another way you can get the double green mana. You're going to have the Thrill of Possibility, the Blazing Crescendos. So you're going to be seeing a lot of cards. I think that it's okay to play an expensive double green card in this deck. So I would probably look to play the Battle Chair, first Thrill of Possibility. I think I would play a 17th land, even though the curve's a little bit on the low side. And then I would definitely play the Furnace Spellbomb with the synergies with the 2 1-drops, the Fuseling and the Evolving Adaptive. That looks pretty good to me. And I guess you could fill out your deck with Forge Hammer Centurion or the second Thrill of Possibility. It's a bit of an open question. How many of the autonomous furnaces do you want to play? It's definitely a little bit awkward to play them in a deck that has this many 1-mana plays, because you're going to want to play your 1-drops on turn 1 when they're in your opening hand. So the Furnace is not something you're just going to get into play for free when it's in your opening hand. I would probably still play one of them in a 17-land deck, though. So this is the build that I have come up with, which is the Battle Chair, 1 Thrill, Autonomous Furnace, Spellbomb, and the Centurion. If we look at what Gab has done instead, he went for only 16 lands, no Battle Chair. He's got a Maze Skullbomb in his deck. He's got the Bladegraft Aspirant in his deck. And he's got 1 Thrill of Possibility, but not 2. I guess he has both Skull Bombs. So here he's gone with a 16 land deck. And as you can see, he also did not play the Monumental Facade, which I think that was something that could have been anticipated during the draft. That, in a 2-color deck, you're just not going to want to play the Facade. And I think it would have been wishful thinking at that point in the draft to think he was going to get to a mono-red deck, because you have to remember he passed the Chimney Rabble for the Monumental Facade. Like, if he was trying to be a mono-red deck, he should have just taken the Chimney Rabble, because that would have just been a better card than the mono-red deck. And it was pretty clear he was not going to wind up with 24 spells for a mono-red deck that he was going to be really happy with. So this is the final deck. I think it's a solid deck. This was kind of a hard seat. This was one of the things that can happen in a draft where you're in one color and you never find your second color, so you're consistently making picks where it's, you're taking the red card over the slightly better card in white or in green in this case, because you're not sure, are you going to be red-green, are you going to be red-white, or you're maybe going to be mono-red. And that just went on for so long in the draft because there was never a clear signal to go into either red-green or red-white, that it led to some picks where, if you knew you were going to be red-green from the start, I think there could have been a slightly better deck at the end. As it is, it's a respectable deck in a tough pod, in a tough seat. And Gab went on to go 2-1 with this deck, is my understanding, which is great, and he went on to finish in the top 8 of the Pro Tour. If you haven't already checked out the coverage of that, you should. So that's it for me. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time.